doing? Welcome to the stream. It's a bit, lighting's a bit different. It's so sunny outside. I think that's what's going on. How are you doing? Hope you have a good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever the hell you are. Yeah, let's record a podcast episode here. Alrighty-o. Today we're going to talk about the scientific paper, which is quite interesting. Space, the final frontier. Hey, Astral, how are you doing? Exploring privacy around the universe and in the limits of human stupidity. Yeah, it's kind of like what's that? In Germany, you have this Star Trek spoof that some students made. That's called Sinnlos im Weltall. And it's like, the intro is like, it's the ship full of idiots and degenerates under command of the notorious drinker, Captain Jean-Luc Picard. I just want to remove this, yes, because he's like an alcoholic, at least in their dub. He's an alcoholic. Yeah, it's very interesting. Anyway, I am a bit low. I'm low. Why am I low? Oh, it might be like the physical button. Is this better? Is this better? This is hello. 1 2. I'm trying not to overmodulate here. Speaking of being low. Thanks for mentioning that, by the way. Yeah, the background music I left that on purpose. Okay, let's figure this out. I changed, as you can see, I changed the stream setup around a little bit. Wait, what? Why can I hear it and it's not recording it? What's going on? Wait, you can hear that, right? Let me see. Yeah. That's turning up in OBS. Why isn't Hindenburg? Oh god, do I need to restart the Hindenburg? Something might be wrong with the Hindenburg. Here we go. The Hindenburg is working. I hope it will not explode while I record this podcast. This name of this program cracks me up every time. It's just like, how did they, like, Hindenburg is just not a good, like, there's two things named Hindenburg, right? The guy who was a very famous German, I think, general and politician or whatever, but who's mostly remembered who, like, getting Hitler into office and shaking his hand. Lauding him in and then dying. And then there's the Zeppelin they named after him, which exploded. So why would you, I mean, okay, they're Danish, so they might not know, but why would you call your podcast recording software Hindenburg? I don't get it. Anyway, let's stop with that bullshit. Let's get a show out here. This is going to be controversial. Let's see how let's see if I can survive this Twitch stream, like my account. I think I have a good argument. If I went bouldering today, my fingers are like crunch. I think I have a good argument if they try to cancel me because of this, because this is, after all, the paper I'm going to talk about is peer-reviewed. It's Cell, like it's one of the Cell offshoot papers, so it's relatively well regarded, and it's by Dr. Anthony Fauci. So, but I think the AI doesn't care, right? Especially on YouTube. I think this might get again flagged on YouTube. We'll see. Let's see what Twitch says. Anyway, let's get this show on the road, right? I've got this red button I can turn on now. Look at that. got that going for us. All right, is that the right font? I'm just remembering. Yeah, that is okay. That works. All right. I was playing around with fonts a little bit there. So let's get the show on the road. Let's see if I can get this right. Here we go. You're listening to The Private Citizen. New media, new rules. This is episode 146 for Tuesday, the 28th of February, 2023. Vaccines were never going to stop the pandemic. Hello, everybody. My name is Fab, coming to you live from the Fab Industries studios in Düsseldorf, in Germany, where it's sunny. It's incredibly sunny. There's not a cloud in the sky. Looks amazing, but it's very cold. It's like 4 degrees or something. Winter has returned. Hello, welcome to the show. Nice to have you. Today we're going to talk about a scientific paper. I'm going to talk about SARS-CoV-2 or COVID again. Yeah, I said I wasn't going to talk. Well, I haven't talked about it in a while. This one is interesting though. So we're going to talk about a scientific paper by Dr. Anthony Fauci, which is very interesting, especially considering what the guy has said over the last few years. I know he's saying something completely different, which is interesting. Incidentally, he's saying something that I've been saying for a long time. So it kind of vindicates me, so I kind of want to talk about that. You might have heard my knuckles crack there. I'm sorry about that. My fingers are like a bit... I don't know. I went bouldering this morning, and now my hands are very sore. So I'm kind of stretching them. I actually, very interesting. I learned today that the European vice champion, the European bouldering vice champion, she's apparently a regular in my gym, and I saw her climbing today, and it made me feel really inadequate. I've got no idea how these people stick to the wall like that. Anyway, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. Lean back. Let's go through this. This is going to be a little bit in depth, but it's actually not. This is we're talking about a paper, but it's what they in scientific circles they usually call a review. It's kind of like a little bit like an editorial. It's like it's what you do. You don't present new research. It's kind of like a commentary on research. So it's relatively understandable, and I've picked out understandable parts, and I'm going to try to make it understandable for people. If you want to follow along, if you want to read the paper, go to privatecitizen.press. There's the show notes for episode 146. As usual, everything's in there. And then without further ado, let's as a pastly streamer I watch from time to time always says, let's crack straight into it. So, today we're going to talk about a paper. Oh, when I'm banging my cup there. Hello, good morning. Wait, can I repeat that? A speech. So let's intro this a little bit. So for a long time, and we're talking years now, at least since like mid 2020, I've said on my blog and I think often probably also on this podcast, I've talked about when we talked about vaccines. I always said, to get this out of the way, right? I'm not a vaccine critic. I'm vaccinated against all. Like a lot of things. Started when I went to Australia in school, right? To get a student visa, you have to have all kinds of jabs. I'm multiple vaccinated against SARS-CoV-2, even though I always said every time I got this shot, which all different vaccines, I got like pretty much every time I got a pretty severe reaction. But so I'm not I'm married to a biologist, a clinical biologist. So I'm I'm not against vaccines. I'm not a vaccine critic by any means. So don't understand this episode wrong. I think vaccines do work. And I think they are good to protect yourself against things. I don't think what this episode is going to be about is they do work and they do what they're supposed to do, but people for some time now have funny ideas what vaccines should do, which were never based in scientific consensus as far as I can tell. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And of course, I also think, like any, a vaccine is a medical procedure. It's like taking drugs, right? It's often now these days categorized as something else. It's also often not called a drug because it's legally not a drug in most countries because, of legality reasons, mostly because of indemnity and stuff like that. But, it's a drug. It's like what would be the English name? In Germany, we would say Wirkstoff, a component that you put into your body to, do something. Like taking drugs, I think you should consult a doctor. And I think, it's not, I don't think you can easily say it's for anybody, right? I think it's totally fine if certain people don't take certain vaccines. For example, in the case of SARS-CoV-2, I think if you're very young, if you look at, what your risks are from this disease, it's I don't think it's needed or very very sensible to get vaccinated. But it's your personal choice, right? But this is something we've held for influenza for a long time, like for decades. If you went to a doctor here in Germany, and you're like 30 and you said, I want to get vaccinated against influenza, they would ask you, do you have some immunodeficient disease? And then you go, no, I'm completely healthy. I just want to get vaccinated. And they would actually tell you, we don't really recommend that. That's not something you would need. That's what I was always told. It's just in recent years that people have spread like some really weird ideas about vaccines, which is what we're gonna Jonathan, hello. Jonathan is in a supporter and producer. Jonathan is in the Twitch chat and says you want us to all get 5G. I don't have 5G. I'm like triple vaccinated. I don't even have 5G on my phone. My phone's too old. You're part of the reptilians, he also says, which, if you know me, yes, I have weird, like my circulatory system is weird. I have very cold limbs in the morning. If you wake me up, and then especially in winter, and then you would shake my hand in the morning, you might think I'm a reptilian. So that's suspicious. But anyway, so there is this idea that was kind of advanced, especially now with this pandemic, that vaccines would kind of stop the spread of diseases. And I've always said for a long time, ever since the mid of 2020 at least, that wouldn't be the case, right? I've always said that the idea that what the vaccine is supposed to do is it is supposed to protect you when you get it against developing whatever, getting infected with whatever pathogen and developing that disease. It is a personal, it's a protection for you as the individual who gets vaccinated. I've always said that this idea that you protect others by getting vaccinated I always thought it was nonsense, because it's not something that's borne out by the scientific literature. And what I thought was even more nonsense was the idea that we could eradicate a disease with vaccines. This is something that a lot of people have been saying a lot everywhere on television, largely unchallenged for a long time. And I have no idea where they get this idea from. I said this from the very beginning, because if you look at, if you look at diseases that were actually eradicated by generally, just diseases that were eradicated, there are only two. And there's only one that applies to humans, which is smallpox. And then there's Rinderpest, which is, funnily, I didn't know this, that until like last week or so, that's also called Rinderpest in English. I had no idea. That's obviously a German word. It's the bovine plague, basically. Rinderpest means bovine plague. And it's only been smallpox. So smallpox has been eradicated. And of course, it is, vaccines played a critical role in this. But so did, for example, isolating patients. That was also part of it. This is how we continually eradicate. We don't really eradicate because it always comes back from some bat or whatever. But like in humans, we continue to eradicate the Ebola virus. By just shutting villages down and shutting places down and not letting people travel and stuff like that. So, that also played a role in eradicating smallpox. But, it worked for smallpox. But, like, that was the only time. That's the only disease in the whole history of mankind that's ever been eradicated, and especially with the help of... that's ever been eradicated. Period. So this idea that there's a pandemic and you could eradicate this virus with a vaccine is in itself just a weird idea. Like, where did this idea come from? This basically never works. And then especially if you look at what kind of virus it is, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because that's what this paper is about. So the paper we are going to talk about today is Rethinking Next Generation Vaccines for Coronaviruses, Influenza Viruses, and Other Respiratory Viruses. It's been published in Cell Host and Microbe, which is a subsidiary paper of the very renowned publication Cell, which I know very well because I actually read a lot of Cell papers because I often edit or help edit stuff my wife writes, and she's basic. Well, I did, but she's a cell biologist. She does a lot with cells, so I read a lot of Cell. And this is by David M. Morans, Jeffrey K. Taubenberger, and one Dr. Anthony S. Fauci. And they're all of these people are from the oh God, I forgot what it's called. Wait, I've written it down in the show notes somewhere. The NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which Fauci obviously runs or was running. I don't know if he actually completely retired now. It's part of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. But so these are all, but it's basically Fauci and two colleagues who have written this, which, as I mentioned before, it's kind of a review paper, so it's not new scientific. It's the opposite. It's not new scientific discoveries. It's a review of the scientific consensus on the matter. And we're going to talk about respiratory viruses, and that's what I was going to say. If you look at the eradication of smallpox, and you look at that like disease vector, and you compare it to something like influenza or coronaviruses, not specifically even SARS-CoV-2, but there are many other coronaviruses, which is why I don't like this term that especially I think came from Germany, just calling the disease corona, because there are many more coronaviruses, and you actually get coronaviruses all the time. There are lots of coronaviruses that cause what we usually call the common cold, which is usually coronaviruses or rhinoviruses. But these respiratory viruses, especially as they talk in this paper, they talk about upper respiratory viruses. So the stuff you get, and then you start, that infects your nose and multiplies very quickly in your mouth and your nose, and then you start coughing, and it flies all over the place. There are, because of the way these viruses are transmitted, they are very, 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 what's the word I'm looking for? I've got problems finding words today. I didn't sleep much tonight. Maybe that's the case for this. They're very infectious, and they're spread very easily among people, which is why we can't eradicate the common cold. And if I've been watching a lot of Star Trek recently because I've been reviewing Picard, but this is a famous episode. It's like one of the first episodes of TNG where Beverly Crusher remarks that we are talking 23 something, and they still haven't eradicated the common cold, which I think is realistic. But anyway, so this idea has been spread about vaccines that they might stop this pandemic and even eradicate this virus, which I thought from the beginning is just nonsense, because at the time, if you were talking like March 2020, right? So we knew there was a pandemic, the virus was spreading, and at that time, if you looked at Wikipedia and you just did a cursory, I'm not even talking about being an expert, I'm just talking about doing cursory research. It was relatively easy to realize that viruses like influenza, like common cold viruses that as we knew even back then, kind of spread like this new virus we were talking about, SARS-CoV-2, which at the time was I think still called nCoV 2019. Before they realized that it was kind of related to SARS and MERS. It was relatively easy to figure out just by reading Wikipedia, basically, that it was very unlikely that, should we develop a vaccine, that we would actually stop, the spread, right? Stop the spreading of the virus, because the thing about these respiratory viruses is they multiply so quickly that even if you have a vaccine, your immune system just can't keep up. Like, even if you are primed, so what a vaccine does, it primes your immune system, that as soon as it sees this virus, it just goes into overdrive and goes, I know what to do, I can kill this. And there are diseases where this works very well, where the incubation period is longer, and your immune system has enough time to actually curtail the spreading of this virus in your body before it comes to the stage where you actually start spreading it. With respiratory viruses, you pretty much, they get in your nose and they start replicating in the cells in your nose. And then as soon as you start coughing them out again. So you're spreading, which is, for example, in a parallel to Ebola, which doesn't spread that way, but why Ebola is so dangerous, or Marburg virus, the Marburg virus family, so dangerous because it also spreads very fast. It spreads so fast that even if your immune system is primed against it, often you still, many people still die from it, because it's just so much faster than your even a primed immune system. On the upside, a lot of people die from it very quickly. Sounds bad, but if you're talking about having lockdowns and keeping people in places so the virus doesn't spread, it actually works in our favor that it kills so many people so quickly. Whereas these respiratory viruses are like the complete opposite. They generally just don't kill people. We're talking common cold. You just have some symptoms, but they spread everywhere. And this is why later in this paper they talk about a Faustian bargain that our immune system is struck with these viruses, which is very interesting. But let's get into this paper. So here, Anthony Fauci is kind of with his colleagues reviewing the current scientific consensus on these vaccines, right, for coronaviruses, influenza virus, and other respiratory viruses. And keep in mind that, Fauci was the chief medical advisor to the U.S. president from the start of 2021 to the end of 2022, and thus has led pretty much the whole response, the U.S. response to this pandemic, which in many cases was a model for the response in other countries, like in Germany, like in my country. We took a lot of lead from what the Americans were doing. And at the beginning of this paper, he comes to the following conclusion. Past unsuccessful attempts to elicit solid protection against mucosal respiratory viruses and to control the deadly outbreaks and pandemics they cause have been a scientific and public health failure that must be urgently addressed. So basically he says the thing I've said from the beginning, and which I've actually been censored for on YouTube, by the way, saying these kind of things. These vaccines have failed to control the deadly outbreaks and pandemics. And this is a problem. And they, at the end of the paper, they actually say, we are excited and invigorated that many investigators and collaborative groups are rethinking from the ground up all of our past assumptions and approaches. And remember, Fauci has been at this for decades, right? He's an old man. He's been in this field for a long time. So that's what he reflects upon. All of our past and are rethinking from the ground up all of our past assumptions and approaches to preventing important respiratory viral disease and working to find bold new paths forwards. This is scientific speech. What the guy's basically saying is we fucked up. We really fucked up. The thing we've been doing with the fight against influenza with vaccines and against, in this pandemic against SARS-CoV-2, we really fucked up. We did wrong, and it's really good that there are now new people and they're rethinking everything. So basically, you could summon this up. This is, he says, we really fucked this one, Fauci out. I'm gone. I'm out of here. I'm really sorry. We didn't do this very well. But there you are, and there's now new people doing this. So that's how it kind of starts. Astro C comments, didn't Anthony the Science Fauci? I like that. Said this virus will kill millions and billions of people. Well, yeah, he kind of did say that, and I agree was kind of right on that front. And I kind of, in retrospect, I recently wrote a blog article where I looked at my coverage in the very beginning on my blog when this virus came out, and I think I was pretty much spot on in. But what I was basically saying back then was like, it kind of looks like this will kind of have a death ratio. So of the people that get infected, how many of them will die, right? That is comparable to the flu. It will probably be influenza. It will probably be a bit worse, and that's kind of what it was. It's like a bit worse. But when I didn't correctly see back then, and this was very early on, mind you, we're talking February of 2020 when I was writing about this, was that it actually spreads much easier than influenza, and it's I don't know if it's per se more infectious, but the way it spreads is much more effective. So it's actually a lot more people got it. It's not per se really more deadly than influenza. I mean, it is a bit, but we're talking like, it's hard to have hard numbers for influenza because we never did like PCR tests for this kind of shit, and we can't really compare numbers. But it's like, it's we're talking like, it's the same ballpark. It's like 0.03. Back when I was writing about this, the most the worst thing the WHO was saying that the death rate would be between 2 and 4%, and we're kind of there. But it's like, there's a recent Dutch paper where they did a lot of research on this, and it's like between 0.04 and I think 2%. And it's obviously very skewed to age group, right? So it's like in the Netherlands, it was like almost like 30% death rate in over 80-year-olds. So it's obviously that's skewed, but that's always been the same with influenza, and it's also the cause of death, and they talk about this in this paper as well. Is very similar, because the actual cause of death usually is lung. What's it called? So yeah, I have problems finding words today. When you have lung inflammation and then you die, Lungenentzündung is called in German, and it's kind of like they're talking about this in this paper as well. It kind of works the same way. These viruses you get, they're generally upper respiratory tract viruses. So you get them in your mouth, in your, in your nose, in all those, the whatever the hollow things behind your face are called. I have problems today, as you can tell. But they infect your upper respiratory tract, and then people who have I would say a more common infection, way of infection, the way they get sick, like the more common thing where you just get a little bit sick. It's kind of like the common cold. It stays in your upper respiratory tract, and then your immune system basically kills it at some point. You spread it, and then sinuses. They're called sinuses. Those holes behind your face. Exactly. Thank you, John. Now you need to tell me what's the lung infection thing. I mean, I could look it up, but I mean, this is what we have Twitch chat for when I do this live. I order one virus for every orifice, please. So you have it in your upper respiratory tract, and if you're healthy and your body doesn't really have, your immune system works as it should. Pneumonia, thank you. Yes, it fights it, and then you spread it because it's in your upper respiratory tract, but it stays there. Then you get rid of it, and then you're okay. The problem comes when you have the virus longer, and it kind of travels down to your lower respiratory tract, and it gets into your lungs. And next I actually talk about in this paper, which is something I had no idea about, but like we have two very different immune responses for the upper respiratory tract and the lower one. And the upper one has struck this Faustian bargain that I'm going to talk about later, where basically, I'm going to talk about that. But like the problem starts when it gets into your lower respiratory tract. And pretty much the same is true for influenza, it turns out. It's kind of like it's a very different virus. It spreads differently, but when it gets into your body, these kind of methods are the same thing. So if you're immune compromised, if you're old, your immune system is not up to the task, and it can't kill it basically in the upper, the virus is storming the beaches in Normandy, and if you can't kill it on the beach, then you're really in trouble, right? Once the virus comes with the flamethrower, I mean, you've seen Saving Private Ryan, then you're in trouble, even if you're in the bunker. Once they get off the boats, Johnson says grabs Dr. House Kane. Yeah. See, I love doing this live. I love live feedback. That's great. So it's kind of like it's actually very similar. So what's the problem here? First, we need to talk about influenza vaccines, right? So we now see this kind of like a similar, in some respects, it's a similar kind of disease. So we can look at influenza vaccines, and we can look at what they did and what they didn't do over the last few decades. And Fauci and his colleagues do this. Let me quote from this paper. Surprisingly, little has changed with influenza vaccines since 1957, when they were first administered in U.S. national vaccination programs. Over the years, influenza vaccines have never been able to elicit durable protective immunity against seasonal influenza virus strains, even against non-drifted strains. So we're talking about strains that are decades old that haven't mutated. Right, that's what they mean by non-drifted strain. By drift, so I mean, I don't know. We learned this in high school, but you might not. So let me just quickly, just on a very high level, my wife is not home, so she can't hear this because she'll get mad. But like, on a very high level, how a virus works is like your virus is like this ball, right? And it has DNA or RNA, whatever in there, which is kind of like a bomb. If that gets into your cell, you're in trouble. So it's like this ball, and it swims around in your blood. And what it needs to do is it needs to get from your blood into your cells, because that's where your DNA is, and it wants to get to the DNA. So it's like this ball, and it has like these things on the outside, which are kind of like keys, right? The cells have on the outside kind of locks. So a cell has like this semi-permeable membrane that can let things in, but it doesn't let everything in, right? The cell is a cell because it has these membranes, and everything that's swimming in the cell is kind of separate from what's outside of the cell, right? And it protects itself from just any old shit getting in the cell. But it needs to, like, hormones and shit from your body, nutrients, all these specialized things, can get from your blood or from actually this, is it called the serum, the intracellular fluid, the fluid that's in between the cells. It needs to get stuff from there into the cell. So your body has like this mechanism where there are like cells in your body, or certain substances have like these keys on the outside, basically. And if they fit into a lock in the cell lets it pass. And that's what a virus does. A virus, like that spike protein that you've heard of on SARS-CoV-2, is like this thing on the outside of the virus that when it comes in contact with the cell goes, oh, I know this. This is something this is something I need. This whatever it is, molecule thing has the right key, so I'm letting it in the cell membrane. But these things that stick out, like these keys basically on the outside of the virus, is also what your immune system uses. So the cells that are in your body that are trying to fight bad shit like viruses and substances that don't belong in your blood or in your intracellular fluid, they kind of try to grab that out of the bloodstream or wherever before it gets to the cells. And they use this stuff. So basically, these keys that let the virus into the cell are also being used by the immune system to recognize the virus and kill it. This is why virus, DNA, RNA, whatever kind of they are, is very happy to mutate, right? We are as like complicated multicellular organism. We don't really like mutation much, which is why our body has like all these mechanisms to kill mutation once it happens in our cells, because we'll get cancer, or we'll get like whatever, 3 arms. We don't want that. So but viruses really like to mutate, and they mutate a lot. So these keys on the outside change on a virus, and a virus changes them. It's not like the virus wants to do this, just kind of like, it's also not really evolution, because it's not on an evolutionary scale, but it's kind of the same process of evolution, right? There's pressures, because the immune system in lots of hosts recognizes the virus now, so it gets killed. So when the virus mutates, and these locks, these keys on the outside mutate in a way that they still let the virus into the cell, but they look different, so the immune system doesn't recognize them. This is the drift they're talking about. That's what different influenza strains are. They are virus populations basically that have mutated. Johnson said I should start drawing things in paint. No, I won't do that, because this is a podcast. There's many people just listening to this in their car, and their head is spinning enough as it is. So this is a problem, and this is why. But even what Fauci talks about here is, even if this isn't happening, even if there's no drift, even if the virus isn't mutating, we still have like no lasting immunity from influenza vaccines, or it's not good. As he says, over the years, influenza vaccines have never been able to elicit durable protective immunity against seasonal influenza virus strains, even against non-drifted strains. Although current influenza vaccines reduce the risk of severe disease, hospitalization, and death, which is why they're good to some degree, their effectiveness against clinically apparent infection is decidedly suboptimal, ranging from 14 to 60% over the past 15 influenza seasons. Okay, so what they mean is if you're vaccinated, there's only 14 to 60% chance that, when you get infected, you won't spread influenza. Right? So it's 60% is shit if you're trying to protect other people by getting vaccinated. So, already with influenza getting, and we never thought, nobody ever said this about the influenza vaccine, right? Nobody ever said get the influenza vaccine to protect other people or to eradicate influenza. Nobody ever said that because everybody knew this is just dumb. That doesn't work. Because, since 1957, we kind of know this. Not that long, but, everything Fauci talks about here, this is not new. This is a review of decades old medical knowledge, which makes it so remarkable. And especially makes it so remarkable that we get this now, basically after the pandemic. But I'm going to talk about that at the end, what it all means. Anyway, furthermore, the duration of vaccine-elicited immunity is measured only in months. And we know that as well. We know that if you're vulnerable and if your doctor says, oh, it's influenza season and, influenza might be a danger to you, so you should get a vaccine, you need to do that every year. Because the vaccine it's not like a polio vaccine. Or like not smallpox, like the other chicken. It's a chicken pox. I think it's Windpocken in Germany, the one where you just get these things and you scratch or whatever. Like, there are vaccines that you get and then you are vaccinated for life. Or we're talking, there's some vaccine. I mean, there's some vaccines like tetanus that you need to refresh often as well. But, so vaccines are not the same. That's also very important because that's also something that's been claimed. People talk about like a vaccine is a vaccine. Vaccines work very differently. And the underlying thing, by the way, this is not, I've said this, I must have said this on the show many times as well. The thing here is, this is all, like we have this problem since 1957 because we do not know a lot about the immune system. We know, a lot about like different cells, T cells, whatever, different cells that make up the immune response. We know mechanisms of the immune response very well. We know exactly how they work. But it's kind of like the whole system is so complicated. Our body is extremely complicated that just knowing how like one cell works or a number of cells works doesn't tell you how they interact, right? This is a common thing in science. This is always why I'm so skeptical about people going on about certain revelations in climate science, because just because you can say, gas works this way in a lab doesn't mean, the atmosphere is very complicated. But let's not get on that tangent. But, this is kind of the same thing. Or like the brain. We know very, very little about how the brain works. Very, very little. We know, there's neurons. Actually, my wife is doing research on a type of neuron that was only discovered, I think, 5 to 10 years ago. Like, there's a neuron we didn't know existed like 10 years ago. Let that one sink in. So, yeah. Anyway, Fauci continues. As of 2022, after more than 6 years of experience with influenza vaccines, very little improvement in vaccine prevention of infection has been noted. As pointed out decades ago, and still true today, the rates of effectiveness of our best approved influenza vaccines would be inadequate for licensure for most other vaccine-preventable diseases. With other words, the effectiveness of influenza vaccines is so shit that in comparison with other vaccines, if we use the standard of a vaccine, for example, against smallpox, where we eradicated the disease, the one disease we ever eradicated, like these vaccines wouldn't even get licensed. But they are licensed because they are important. Not for the majority of the population, but for a crucial part of the population. People that are over 60, 70. My grandma, who almost turned 101, who lived 100 years, over 100 years. In the last, 20 years of her life, she always got the influenza vaccine because, you're if you're that old, you're at risk. It's an important vaccine, which is why we license them. But it's also important not to forget what they don't do. Now, a critical thing is we knew all this. We've known this for decades. So why did people think SARS-CoV-2 would be different? Because there we apparently have the same problem, as Dr. Fauci says, quote, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the rapid development and deployment of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines has saved innumerable lives and helped to achieve early partial pandemic control. However, as variant SARS-CoV-2 strains have emerged, basically second wave, deficiencies in these vaccines reminiscent of influenza vaccines have become apparent. The vaccines for these two very different viruses have common characteristics. They elicit an incomplete and short-lived protection against evolving virus variants that escape population immunity. So we have no population immunity, right? More than 50 years ago, the development of successful vaccines against some of the most important respiratory viruses, including measles, mumps, and rubella, led to the hope that vaccine could soon be developed for all the other respiratory viruses. However, natural infections with these three vaccine-controlled respiratory viruses, as well as smallpox and varicella zoster virus, VZV, are not representative of infections caused by most respiratory viruses. So he kind of explains a little bit here where this mistaken belief comes from, right? We had some viruses that we developed very successful vaccines for, right? More than 50 years ago. And then people were like, hey, this is great. We can do this for the other respiratory viruses. And we kind of ignored, and by we, I mean like as a global community, people like the WHO or whoever, kind of ignored that the reality, which was like, no, it actually does. Now it looks like these viruses were rather untypical for the group, which is why the vaccines work that well. On typical respiratory viruses like influenza or like, other coronaviruses or like rhinoviruses, this does not work. In the show notes, I have a link to this paper, of course, also to Wikipedia about eradicated diseases and how that was done, if that's interesting to you. So while SARS-CoV-2 is as a virus relatively different from influenza, or radically different. I mean, this is something. This also something. This I found something I saw in the beginning of the pandemic. So in the US it was a little bit different. So in the US we had maybe not, because I think Fauci is also a virologist. In Germany we had Mr. Drosten, who's a virologist, and when journalists didn't know what this pandemic was, they turned to these people, to virologists, right, to ask them about this virus. Now, a virologist knows about the virus, knows how the virus works, right? But a virologist is not an epidemiologist who studies how a virus spreads on a population scale, and is not an immunologist, although, most virologists obviously have a lot of immunology knowledge, right? But they're not immunologists, so they're not specialists for how the immune system works per se. They're specialists for what viruses look like, right? It's kind of like, like all these different specializations you have with doctors, right? For example, I know a lot of heart doctors, so to speak, and they're cardiologists, right? And they're so those are the people that for example, my wife does research with, that like, so if your heart doesn't beat regularly, right? They do things like electrophysiology, right? They they shock your heart, or they implant things that will like a pacemaker or something like this, right? So those are cardiologists, but then there are also heart. I don't even know what's the see, I'm gonna look this one up. What's Herzchirurg? Today, I don't know, my brain's in German mode or something. It's heart surgeons, right? Who people always think that those are like the heart doctors, but they are like literally, they only do surgery. Like, so if you have if one of your valves doesn't work correctly and you need a replacement valve, that's what they do. Or if you need a replacement heart, they cut your heart out, right? Cardiologist doesn't do that. Cardiologist doesn't even know how to like cut anything open, right? They diagnose problems with your heart when it's still like beating, basically. So there's all these different specializations, and the problem when you're asking, like, hindsight's 2020, but I looked at this, and I must have said this on the show as well, very early on. It was weird to me that the press was going to virologists when, they had epidemiology questions, right? Because I think they just asked Drosten here in Germany in the beginning, and then he was just the guy, or like Fauci in the US was the guy, and they didn't ask the epidemiologists. And that was really weird. I mean, of course, a virologist can make statements about epidemiology, and some of them know quite a lot about epidemiology, but they're not the specialists, right? It's kind of like asking a car mechanic about motorbikes, right? They kind of know about motorbike. It's all the same. It's an engine, there are brakes, right? But like, you wouldn't really. I ride a motorbike. I wouldn't have a car mechanic service my motorbike, really. You go to the you go to the guy who knows what he's doing, and this is kind of really weird. And I think if we had asked the right people, the people who, if we actually had asked people who knew about vaccines, right, and the history of vaccines and the theory and how they work and what they can do and can't do, then we wouldn't have stumbled in this trap. But we asked virologists about vaccines or something. I don't know. And while the virus, so the thing is, the virus is very different. So if you look at, in virologists, if you ask them, is SARS-CoV-2 similar to influenza? They say, no, it's a complete, like if you look at it on the micro, it's completely different. It's like comparing the little sports plane, like a Cessna, to like an Airbus A380, right? It's completely different. But the effect really in your body and to your immune system is actually not that different, which is what they're talking about here, which is the thing we are now realizing after the fact. Great. So quoting from this paper, non-systemically replicating respiratory viruses, apparently including SARS-CoV-2, so we're now comparing influenza to SARS-CoV-2, tend to repeatedly reinfect people over their lifetimes without ever eliciting complete and durable protection. The external influenza A virus, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase proteins, I'm trying to do this right in case my wife listens to this, are comparatively plastic, and positively selected non-synonymous mutations result in immunologically significant antigenic drift. So what they're saying is, if you look at influenza A, these proteins on the outside of the virus, the keys basically for the cell's locks, are plastic, meaning they're changeable, right? And you can have mutations that change these quite a lot, really. Continuing here in the paper, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein has shown a similar plasticity with the emergence of multiple variants with altered antigenicity that has complicated its control through current vaccination strategies. So it's comparable in this regard to the completely different, very different virus, but this very protein thing that is important for immunology is kind of comparable. Taking all of these factors into account, it is not surprising that none of the predominantly mucosal respiratory viruses have ever been effectively controlled by vaccines. Let me repeat this. This paper talks about scientific knowledge we are possessing for decades. Like, he talks about 1957 and the 60s and whatever. And then says, it is not surprising that none of the predominantly mucosal respiratory viruses have ever been effectively controlled by vaccines. So why did everybody think they would? Where does this come from? Further quoting, this observation raises a question of fundamental importance. What the fuck have you been doing the last 3 years, Fauci? No, of fundamental importance. What the hell were you saying? No. If natural mucosal respiratory virus infections do not elicit complete and long-term protective immunity against reinfection, how can we expect vaccines, especially systematically administered non-replicating vaccines, to do so? Good question. I've been asking myself that for the last 3 years now. So, with other words, thinking that these SARS-CoV-2 vaccines would actually, significantly curtail the spread of the disease or even, eradicate it, was never backed by scientific evidence. Everything we knew, we don't know the virus, right? So it's like, before you do the research, when you're in a pandemic that's happening, you kind of have to extrapolate, right? Because you can't, by the time you do the research on the people that are sick, it's over, right? That takes years. So you kind of need to extrapolate from the body of scientific knowledge that you have at the point in time, which there was nothing that would suggest that this would happen, that we could spread, curtail the spread with vaccines. That was wishful thinking that was picked up by the press and then got into the heads of politicians, and then we're going to talk about what it did, but yeah. But it was wishful thinking. That is no way to base a crisis plan on. Like, you shouldn't base crisis response on wishful thinking. That is dumb. So now the interesting question, so now this is, I'm vindicated, I've said this from the beginning, all right, let's not talk about that anymore. What we now want to talk about, why is that the case? And they talk about this in this paper as well, which is this is not, again, let me reiterate, this is not new research. This is a review of well-known, of a body of scientific knowledge that's been there for a long time. So, and now in this paper, they talk about a Faustian bargain. If you don't know what that term means, basically deal with the devil, right? So there's the story of Faust, which is like a German mythology kind of thing. But the most well-known expression of it is Faust, which is a book in 2 parts by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who is basically Germany's foremost poet. Although it's it's kind of, I think most people know it as a theater play, where it's, there's a guy called Dr. Faustus, who strikes a deal with the devil. And that's what he's talking about. He's talking about a deal with the devil. So it seems that these viruses, to sum it up, I'm going to read a bit from the paper, but to sum it up, because these viruses are not very deadly, generally speaking. I'm not saying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have died from SARS-CoV-2. I'm not saying that. But compared to other viruses, say Ebola or whatever, these are not deadly enough that our immune system, is going all out to kill them. It has struck a deal with the devil, a Faustian bargain, to deal with them differently than with other, maybe more deadly diseases. And this is, I guess, what makes them more deadly as well, right? Because, in the end, this is why people died of SARS-CoV-2, right? Because our immune system treats it like a normal respiratory virus, which generally doesn't kill us, so it doesn't go all out. It doesn't go like, oh my God, this is what the fuck is this? Red alert, captain to the bridge, general quarters. It's a bit more easygoing, which is interesting. So, quoting from this paper, the terms disease tolerance and immune tolerance refer to the still incompletely characterized but distinct category of mammalian immune defense mechanisms that allow hosts to, quote, accept infection and other antigenic stimuli to optimize survival, right? So we are kind of, we're talking about a host organism actually getting, if you look at it over its lifetime or whatever, or the population, getting a better chance at survival by actually accepting an infection instead of fighting it all out. From the teleological point of view of the pathogen, mucosally replication non-systematic respiratory viruses have adapted over millennia to tolerize host immune environments to optimally infect, replicate, and spread quickly before adaptive immune response can be fully marshaled to control them. So what we're talking about here is, like, if you look at it from the point of the virus, right? A virus is basically, it's not even alive, right? It's a piece of code, basically. Right? It's a piece of DNA or RNA, whatever. It's a piece of, molecule. It's a string of molecules that wants to replicate itself, like a virus. That's why, a classic computer virus. That's why they're called viruses. And some of the most successful at this are these respiratory viruses. If you look at, evolution on our planet and millions of years, we've had them for millions of years. We'll probably have them for millions of years. They generally don't really kill us. They live more in the common cold. It's kind of, it's like a symbiosis almost, although it's not a symbiosis because we as humans don't get anything from it. But it's like, the virus infects us. It doesn't really kill us. It just makes us a bit sick. And then we spread it, and then we get rid of it at some point. And then the virus can basically lives on, in air quotes, because, it gets spread everywhere. Whereas a virus like Ebola is not very successful because it just kills too many people too quickly. And if bats didn't have another immune system, which is that's in this paper. I don't think I'll be quoting this, but like, bats have this Faustian bargain. Bats have taken that to a whole nother level. Bats have an immune system where, when they kind of like hibernate, they kind of like they just let diseases do whatever, they just let them in the body. They're just like, they have an immune system that kind of just manages them. It's not set up to eradicate a lot of diseases. It's just like, they just live with it. They just get Ebola or whatever, and they're just, okay, I'm a bit sick, but I'm not dying from it, right? This kind of like a, which is also also benefits the virus. So that's why the fucking bats are like this reservoir of these fucking viruses, which is where they always emerge from. Anyway, continuing. From the teleological point of view of the pathogen, mucosally replicating non-systematic respiratory viruses have adapted over millennia to tolerized host immune environments to optimally infect, replicate, and spread quickly before adaptive immune responses can be fully marshaled to control them. The immunologic Faustian bargain between tolerance versus infection control, which permits transient moderated infection by respiratory agents of low or intermediate pathogenicity to retrain the destructive forces of an immune elimination response, may be problematic for vaccine control of respiratory viruses, not only in the local and systemic sensing of vaccine antigens, but also in eliciting optimal immune responses. So, if you read this paper, there's a bit, they go into a bit more detail. So basically what's happened is, so our immune system is there to remove substances, and let's call pathogens substances. Virus is basically a substance. It's a little bit like, poison. It's not alive, right? It's just a molecule. So our body is set up to remove these molecules we ingest or breathe in that would otherwise do us harm, right? And there's, other mechanisms than the immune response. We have other organs that filter poisons and stuff like that, But like the problem is that if our immune system would be too fine-grained and would just go into overdrive all the time, that would be a problem, because we ingest like shit all the time. We've got like, if you look at your hands, there's billions of bacteria on there, right? And most of them don't hurt us. Like our whole skin is covered in bacteria that we actually need to survive. So there's lots of bacteria that our immune system just can't, doesn't need to do anything about. And there's lots of like little molecules that are probably good for us, but they won't kill us. So it just really doesn't, it doesn't need to do anything about it. Like allergies are basically what happens when the system kind of malfunctions, because your body will suddenly react to something. I'm allergic against pollen, like from grass, right? Which don't hurt me at all. Like they don't do anything to my body. The allergic response is my immune system going, oh shit, that's a virus, a bacteria, something we need to eliminate that. So all the pain I go through when I'm sick, when I'm allergic, when I get like a reaction, is basically just my body. And I can always tell if I have like a summer cold or if I just have hay fever. I mean, if you are allergic this way, you will know this. Okay, this might get a little bit disgusting. I'm sorry about this, but like the mucus your body develops is like when you're just allergic, it's completely clear, because it's like just the stuff your body actually generates to wash out all the shit from your nose, right? Whereas when you actually have a cold, well, as long as it's virus, it's also clear. But then you get, the bacteria superinfected, and then it starts to get, yellow or green or whatever. It gets very different, because then there's actually immune cells in there, right? Those are like, white blood cells, whatever, that kind of need to kill things. But you can actually tell. So this is what happens when your immune system is too active, and it can get even worse, right? If you have, that's what autoimmune diseases are, right? Jonathan mentioned in Twitch chat earlier, Dr. House. There's this running gag in Dr. House where it goes, it's never lupus, right? Which is kind of a joke on the show. Now, lupus is not a joke. It's a very, very bad disease. If people who have it. There's other diseases. I actually know somebody who's affected by morbus Crohn, which is also an autoimmune disease. It's kind of your body treating I think it's the lining of your intestine as like, or like stuff that gets into your intestine as like, other, something bad, and then attacking it. Like it's your immune system is attacking yourself. Like rheumatoid arthritis is basically your immune system thinking that the stuff that's in your joints, that the thing that covers the bones in your joints, the stuff thinks that is evil and a virus or whatever, and it starts attacking that, and you get inflammation. That's what rheumatoid arthritis is. So that's also an autoimmune disease. So that's what happens when our immune system goes into overdrive. And basically what happens here is that through a process of evolution over millions of years, our bodies have learned that these respiratory viruses aren't so bad, and we kind of scaled down our immune response to that, because otherwise we would, so that's kind of like, that's also, if you ever had influenza, how it kind of starts like a cold, and that's your body reacting to, a respiratory virus, kind of like a cold, and then it doesn't go away, right? And then you get the fever and all of that. And that's what your body, fever is an immune response. Your body raises the temperature to a point where these viruses can't replicate that well. That's what fever is. Or bacteria can't replicate, can't thrive as well. So that's why you get a fever, right? So our body doesn't want, because a fever is also dangerous. If you're not, we're talking like the body doesn't know about hospitals. We're talking like thousands of years ago, right? A fever can kill you. So you don't want to get a fever every time you get a cold. So this is basically what happens here, and what Fauci says here is that this mechanism So what a vaccine does, a vaccine primes your immune system. It gives a leg up to immune system. It boosts your immune system with its own mechanisms, right? It kind of gives it a head start. It goes, here's the stuff. A vaccine goes like, here's the stuff you would have discovered yourself, right, in about a few days. So we're giving it to you now. Here's like a little, it's like a time travel, like in Star Trek, it's like a time traveler showing up and saying, this is what's going to happen in 2 days. We can help you prevent that if you do this. So that's what a vaccine does, right? But it's dependent on your immune system. Giving your immune system a leg up means, it uses your immune system, it uses the mechanism of your immune system. And what Fauci says in his papers, what we knew all along about other similar viruses is that because our immune system is not as effective against them for good reasons, this giving it a leg up doesn't really, it helps, but it doesn't help completely, right? And we knew this, and there was no reason we'd be thinking that this virus was different, but wishful thinking. So the point here, another important point, and I mentioned this before, vaccines are not created equal. Not all vaccines are the same. This paper says, quote, some vaccines only prevent severe disease, for example, requiring hospitalization, as appears to be the case with some influenza virus and SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. So you can't go and say, like the press has done for years now, we eradicated smallpox. Vaccines are great. So they're going to eradicate this disease. No, this is a very different kind of vaccine. Well, it's not technically, it's the same kind of vaccine. Vaccines are always kind of the same. They do the same thing. But because our immune system works differently in response to these viruses, it doesn't do the same thing. And this is new. This is something, this is the press. And interestingly, because of that, I think because of the press, the government has also been wrong. And like health organizations, like the WHO in the last 2 years has says stuff about vaccines that is patently wrong if we believe Dr. Fauci and his review here, which this all sounds very reasonable to me. Astral C says about vaccines, gives your body a police wanted poster. Yeah, basically, yeah. Like, isn't this, like we had this, what was this show? We had this show in Germany. I watched this as a kid. It's like Adventures in Your Body. And it kind of explains how your body works with like these little, it's like an animated series with these little guys running around. And that would be something like they explain that in the show, right? That the vaccine comes in and goes, here, we're looking for this guy. And then it has a picture of the virus. And they go, hey, that's the guy. So your immune system doesn't have to wait till the break-in happens, right? It can go ahead of time, can go, oh, we know this guy broke in somewhere else, so we know we can arrest him now. Yeah. So this paper comes to at the end, it kind of comes to the conclusion that vaccines could be a lot better. And, this is Dr. Anthony Fauci and the NIA. Do we call it NIAID? NIAID? The National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So the foremost authority on this kind of subject in the US. Right? And the guy who ran this for a long time comes to the following conclusion. With influenza, for example, vaccines historically have been designed to prevent upper respiratory infection, not secondary pulmonary infection. That's what I was talking about, the lower, lung type infection. Not secondary pulmonary infection associated with spread from the upper respiratory tract. This is proven problematic because current influenza vaccines are suboptimal at both preventing infection and eliciting pulmonary immunity. So there's kind of two, as I said before, this paper goes into the fact that there's two Our immune system works differently in the upper respiratory tract than it works in the pulmonary tract, right? And so if a vaccine targets the upper respiratory tract, then we have a problem. So that is why I think what they're trying to say here is, when you have COVID, the actual disease, right? You have a bad case, you have COVID, and you get to the hospital, and your lungs kind of infected, and your lungs starting to stop working. Like the vaccines don't protect against that, because they prime your upper respiratory immune system, like that part. And that is good. That's good. That's something we want. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying don't get vaccinated. By God, I'm not. By God, I'm not even religious. By Bob, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, we need to be aware of the limitations. And the limitation is that, it helps you there. But should this virus actually get into your lung and start spreading there, then the vaccination doesn't help you. At that point, and this might explain why, this vaccine prevents or help, actually in countries where you see the vaccination, you can see that there's less people less people hospitalized, and also less people going to the ICU. But once they're in the ICU, there's not much change. I'd always assumed this was because, they're obviously already probably immunocompromised, or, they have other, comorbidities or whatever that make it a challenge for the immune system. But this would also suggest that the immune system in your lungs is just not being primed by this vaccine. So continuing here. This has proved problematic because current influenza vaccines are suboptimal at both preventing infection and eliciting pulmonary immunity. Although influenza SARS-CoV-2 vaccines reduce disease severity when vaccines fail to prevent infection, significant numbers of fatalities still occur, resulting in tens of thousands of annual influenza deaths in the United States. With the imperfections of these vaccines, it seems a public health imperative to aggressively pursue better vaccines and vaccination strategies. Durably protective vaccines against non-systematic mucosal respiratory viruses with high mortality rates have thus far eluded vaccine development efforts. So what they're saying here is that the vaccines we have, they're important and do things, but they don't do what people think they do. And these people who are experts in this field say what we really need is new vaccines. Now, the problem is they also say that we have no idea, they're not on the horizon, right? It's not like we need to do a few more years of research and then we got it. We don't even know. We only have a slight grasp on, as they mention in this paper, what the reasons might be. So we kind of know what we need to do, right? We need to overcome. We need a vaccine that overcomes this problem that our immune system just isn't set up to fight these viruses correctly. And we need a vaccine that addresses the pulmonary spread of this virus, not only the upper respiratory spread. So we kind of have the goals, but we don't know how to get there. Which is, okay, this is what a science review is, right? He's basically saying, I'm Fauci, I'm old, I'm out, we fucked up. But I'm writing this kind of guide for new scientists that are working in this field, what they should concentrate on. And I think that's, that is laudable and that is good. But I'm more interested, because I'm not a vaccine scientist, I'm more interested in what that says about what we've been doing wrong for the last 3 years. And of course, I've been always on this show. I've been very critical of ideas like immunity passports. So in the show notes, privatecitizen.press, in the show notes for this episode, I also link the tag for immunity passports. So if you want, you can listen to all the previous episodes where I talk about this. But what he's saying there basically says that that immunity passports are bullshit. And the society, the rules we made, the idea that you have you prove that you're vaccinated and then you can get in somewhere, you can't, or whatever. This is all complete bullshit. Doesn't work, because the underlying, we're checking that you have a vaccine, that you're vaccinated, right? But the underlying assumptions that this idea is based on, the assumptions on vaccines are just wrong. It's what Dr. Fauci just told us. And to quote this paper one last time, a key challenge for next generation vaccines is determining if one-size-fits-all vaccines or vaccines targeted to key risk groups will be useful. So the one-size-fits-all vaccine just isn't there, right? So it doesn't make any sense to have a society that says, okay, everybody needs to get vaccinated, because, as we just learned, these vaccines don't help, reduce the spread of this virus significantly. They don't protect other people. They just protect you. So society checking if you're vaccinated is dumb, right? It's like saying, it's like checking if somebody is doing enough sports, right? It's like having you can only come into this McDonald's if you actually can prove that you're going running 3 times a week, but because otherwise you're gonna get fat and then you die. Right? It's not about protecting. That would be about governing your people's, getting people to do things. It's not about protecting society, and it never was. I mean, this is a review of scientific knowledge we had in 2020. So all these shitty, dumb rules based on vaccines were bullshit from the beginning, says Dr. Fauci. Now, I'm a bit pissed off. Even though I think it's laudable that he does this, and he's written this paper, I'm a bit pissed off. Let's talk about that. So let's talk about what does this mean, right? It's nice that we know this, and it's nice that I've been vindicated, but what does this mean about the grand, in the grand scheme of things? What does this mean? Basically, it means that society at large was misled by politicians and also, I think, by my colleagues in the press. It now, based on this paper, and I'm not only basing this on this paper, I'm just taking this paper as something from a preeminent expert that is just good to quote, basically, because I mean this all gels with stuff I've been looking at for 2-3 years. Ever since this started, this is everything. This is how I always I've seen the scientific consensus. But but now Fauci says it seems obvious now that from the start of the pandemic, we and experts like immunologists and epidemiologists had no reason to believe that this virus, this specific mucosal respiratory virus, was going to behave different than the other mucosal respiratory viruses we'd seen before. So taking that for taking this assumption that it kind of seems to work the same way, it was from the very beginning extremely highly unlikely that we would develop a vaccine that is highly effective over more than 1 or 2 seasons, right? It was, looking at what we knew, it was likely that this vaccine was going to be like an influenza vaccine, i.e., it had to be refreshed a lot. You have to basically take it every year, and it doesn't do anything to slow the spread. And it's based on that. It seemed almost impossible that a vaccine we would come up with would eradicate COVID as a disease. if we just get everybody to vaccinate. And if you maybe remember, that was the thing like 2 years ago. Everybody needs to get vaccinated. We need to get everybody vaccinated because then we can protect society at large. That was bullshit. That was not based on any scientific consensus, either at the time, nor now, nor before that. We're talking about knowledge. Fauci says influenza vaccines are basically unchanged since 1957. And for almost that long, we've known what they can do and can't do. So we've kind of known this since the 60s. Where did this idea come from? Like, this has never worked. So basically, this has never worked. Like, stopping the spread with a vaccine has never worked for comparable viruses, ever. So where's this idea coming? Where came this idea from that it suddenly would? Like, that's just blind hope and dogmatism. Because, science says, and now everybody is convinced that it would. Astro C says, it proves to me that science has become a new religion and that you can get the label blasphemous because of disagreements. Yeah, basically. I mean, that's basically what happened to me, when I said this. I wasn't really called blasphemous, but it was kind of like, you can't say that, and that's like irresponsible to say. What do you mean? So you, the person that says, science says this, thinks it's irresponsible if I quote the current scientific consensus back to you? How is it had I had this paper in 2020, I could have said, we know this since 1957. This has never changed. And the amazing thing to me is, like, on a societal level and on what happened back then, is that it's not like you had to be an expert to recognize this. I recognized this. And we're talking like 2 weeks into the whole situation. We're talking like March or April by the latest, a few weeks in. I was going, no, like, they were going to develop a vaccine, and then it's gonna help and whatever. Like, no. Yeah, it's gonna help, right? It's gonna help you as a person. That's the thing. Vaccines work, and they are important. They're important as protection for individuals, right? I believe they should be optional, and they should be for vulnerable individuals. And if you think you're vulnerable, even if your doctor doesn't think, so be it. Take the vaccine. I don't care. I don't care what you do. But I care when the government and the press goes, like, you need to take the vaccine to protect other people, when that is obviously wrong. And I think what's even worse, I mean, this is not to me, this is not about like being right back then, or showing what we did wrong. I think what happened here was a grave disservice to the people, and I think we actually killed a lot of people by being this misguided, because what we kind of didn't do, and what I think we should have done, instead of concentrating so much on like lockdowns, masks, and vaccines, was just reform our medical system. I've said this a lot of times. Doesn't matter in what country you live in, how good your medical system is. In all the countries, chances are, wherever you listen to this, we all have the same problem. No matter if you have the NHS, if you have the German medical system, the Danish medical system, doesn't matter. All of these systems, to a larger or smaller extent, I give you that, but generally they all have the main problem is they have been turned into an industry, and we're talking $1 billion industry. There's such a big industry that, interestingly, I write a lot about tech companies. All the big tech companies, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, they've all they started with selling hardware or software. Then they went to the cloud and kind of made that their business. And then next, they all have identified healthcare as the next business, because it's such a big and profitable business. And instead of as a society and as a state that cares about its citizens, reclaiming this industry and going, healthcare is not about individuals or companies making money. Healthcare and a state healthcare system, for example, like we have in Germany, its job should be it should be there to serve the public, right? It should put the good of the public first and not the bottom line of companies. Hospitals shouldn't be about making money, and they all are. But they shouldn't. They should be about curing people, right? And had we, instead of just pouring, I'm not saying we shouldn't have developed the vaccines. There's some really good, amazing research and science being done to develop, especially these mRNA vaccines. If you like them or not, like the science is fascinating behind that. It was originally it's like a German company that developed that. It was originally it's actually much more promising there. It's a personalized cure for certain kinds of cancer. So they basically used this mRNA to train, cancer is also an immune disease, basically, because cancer is cells doing what they shouldn't do. And usually your immune system goes and kills those cells, and cancer is when your immune system doesn't recognize that and lets it grow. So these mRNA vaccines were actually developed as a personalized cure against certain cancers that you just can't fight with radiation or whatever. It's fascinating. It's some really, really good science. But now it's just a billion-dollar industry, we're just cranking out vaccines and you're just now pouring all the money. Instead of pouring that much money in there, I'm not saying don't develop the vaccines, but also, right, don't just focus on vaccines, just focus on masks, just focus on lockdowns. Focus on the medical system. I said this from the very beginning when they said, okay, we all need to stay in because we need to flatten the curve because our medical systems are, they can't cope. I said, okay, good. I said this on the show. I'm okay with that under the provision that once it gets better, we recognize that our medical systems weren't adequate for this task and then reform the medical system, like improve that. And who cares if it's not profitable, right? Who cares if the ICU just has 80% slack that you don't need, that you only need when you get a pandemic? That's like, had we done this in the beginning, after the first wave, had we started with that, had we fucking reclaimed our medical system and sorted this shit out, then we would have been set up for all the other waves. And we would be set up now for all kinds of other shit, other pandemics that come along, right? We would have, had we concentrated on getting more doctors, getting more nurses, paying them. Don't get the fucking equipment. Who cares about the equipment? We need people, right? Make it a job people actually want to do. Like I know a lot of doctors, right? And I'm not talking like doctors who you just have a practice and your GP or whatever. I'm talking about hospital doctors, like people like cardiologists. I don't understand these people. They get paid well, but like they work so much. They work so many hours. They work without sleeping. They don't have social lives, most of them. Like all the money they make, like I knew doctors in Hamburg who had like the most amazing houses, like right next to the river, which is like beautiful and really expensive, and they were never home. Like they have an amazing Porsche in their garage, but they never drive it because they just go by bicycle to the hospital, and then because they just stay there for hours on end. It's like, I don't understand. Like I am a workaholic and I love my job and I work a lot, but like, these people, it's a whole nother level. Like, it's also interestingly, if you watch like shows like Grey's Anatomy, and they're all like, these people are all good looking. It's completely unrealistic. If you actually go to a hospital, like one of the big hospitals, and then you go to like a like a cardiology or whatever department, they all look that good as well because they don't fucking eat. They just run around all day. They have no time to eat. Like they're just calorie deficient all the time. It's like no wonder they're all very slim and good looking. like, I don't understand these people, but like, we really should, like, it's like kind of like the games industry. Like, it's people being exploited because they really like their jobs, and then they think what they're doing is right? So, but it shouldn't be that way. They should be paid well and work a lot less, because then they also make less mistakes and you don't fucking die on the operating table. And we could all fix that. Like, a lot of that could just easily be fixed if hospitals didn't have to be profitable. Because there is slack, right? Because it's like a company, right? There is slack in the system, but currently they're squeezing it all out to make money. If they stop squeezing and take that money that they would take as profit, which is millions of billions of euros, dollars, whatever, and pour that back in, they could make the jobs more attractive. The people didn't have to work so much. Everything would be fucking better. It's so easy as well. But it isn't going to happen. Like, that's not what we did, right? It was obvious that our medical systems weren't coping. Nobody, no fucking health minister of any country I know went, our medical systems aren't coping, we need to reform our medical systems. It can't go on like this. No, they were like, wear a fucking mask. While we keep raking in the billions, because it's $1 billion industry. And they don't want this to be like, I don't even know if it needs to be state-owned. I don't give a damn. Like, I'm actually for having hospitals state-owned, at least like in a country like in Germany, which is like, I'm a fucking conservative by most people's standards, right? I'm like the last person who says anything should be state-owned. It's not per se better if it's state-owned. Like, I fucking hate communism, socialism. This is all like historically proven that all of that shit doesn't work. But maybe in like small areas, it can't get much worse, actually, right? Yeah, I know there need to be companies. I know there needs to be money, that needs to be poured into research. And I'm not saying like, let's go all like Joseph Stalin on the whole thing, right? And start shooting people. But like, I mean, let's pull the screw a bit more in the other direction. In Germany, it's not that long ago, that like maybe 10, 20 years ago, that the healthcare system was a lot better. Because there were lots of hospitals that were owned by communities and cities. They weren't all private, and that actually was better. It was objectively better. The healthcare system was objectively better then. So why don't we just go back in that direction? And it would have been, like, the fucking thing is, it would have been the easiest thing for politicians to sell that as well. If you'd actually been a health minister, like that fucking idiot, fucking asshole Jens Spahn, right? If you actually been there and you'd been competent and you'd actually had some balls, you could have actually pulled it off. Because that would have been you'd have, like, in the middle of the pandemic, if you went in the moment the hospitals were overflowing and people were dying because we didn't have enough personnel for the ICU, right? In that moment, if you went, okay, we're gonna go into crisis mode, we're gonna try to fix this, but once this is over, once this calms down again, we're gonna reform the hospital system. Like, everybody would have said yes. You'd be the hero. Like, you can't tell me that these guys aren't fucking corrupt. That can be the only reason why they didn't do this. Or they didn't have the balls. Or I don't know. But it's just, it infuriates me. And the problem is that stuff like this, stupid, one of these things was like the stupid idea about vaccines that got just spread everywhere, what they apparently should do or have ever done, which is dumb. The idea that all vaccines are the same, they work the same, so if you can eradicate smallpox with a vaccine, then the vaccine can just as well eradicate COVID. No, it can't. And we knew that. And it's one thing if people were that fucking incompetent, all those journalists, all those politicians that preach this shit. It's one thing if they're just incompetent, but then they go, oh, it's science. No, it's not fucking science. It's not. It's here you have Dr. Fauci telling you that it's not since 1957. You fucking idiots. Sorry, I'm getting angry here. And it's like, it's weird because Fauci was one of the leading figures, right, in this. He's one of the leading figures in this whole thing. in this push for vaccines, masks, everything, social control instead of medical reform. And now, when he's leaving and he's retiring, he's like, as a parting gift, he gives us this paper. And I don't know how to react. I really, honestly don't know. I don't know if I should be really glad that the things I've been saying for 3 years have been vindicated by the guy everybody was listening to and was quoting against me for the last 3 years. And he's one of the preeminent, experts in this field for decades. Like, that guy's vindicating me. I should be really glad about that. But then on the other hand, I'm also extremely angry about his fucking cheek. Like, the fucking cheek on that man. Right? For like 2 years, he's doing like this whole a public thing, the public response, like state response in the US that all the other countries model like what they do after, based on what, we can do with these vaccines. And then as soon as he's out, he's like, yeah, and by the way, this is all bullshit. We knew since 1957 that was not going to work, but we tried anyway. But, now it's shit. It didn't work. We fucked it. We need new researchers need to have new ideas. I'm out. Goodbye. I'm gone. Oh, man. Anyway, I've had this paper on the docket for a while, basically since it was published, and I thought it was really important to talk about this. I hope this didn't come across as a I was right episode. I try not to do this kind of shit. I try to give you some helpful information as well. Learn a little bit about the Faustian bargain, which that was new to me. There's these different levels of immune response with these viruses. That was different to me. How it's different in your lung than in your nose. I thought it was kind of cool. I hope you saw the same thing and found this useful, and you can tell me about it. So by that I mean you can tell me if you found it useful, or if you didn't. Or if you have an idea what I should talk about, anything you find interesting, things you think the news media has overlooked, I'm up for all that. Talking about that. So please go to privatecitizen.press, go to the producer feedback section, and it tells you how to contact me. You can do that on the forum. Forum.fab.industries is where we hang out. There's also links in the show notes and on the contact page. And some people have done, we had discussions on the forums, and some of this I want to read out. So we had Yevgeny, who writes a lot on the forum and generally writes a lot of interesting and intelligent things, made a joke. He said, it suddenly struck me that I never realized how the private citizen was actually obvious, blatant, very aggressive propaganda for critical thinking. I think I'll keep listening, though. You do some great journalism, and I don't mind critical thinking too much. Which I thought, I thought that was a nice quip. I guess he isn't too wrong. Taking this seriously, I know it's a joke, but taking it seriously, I would say that I think propaganda is usually categorized that it's driven by some kind of powerful interest. Usually the government or parts of the government, or companies, which I would, people with money or whatever. You generally need money to effect propaganda, i.e. public relations, same thing. And I think for me, like, critical thinking is like the ultimate anti-propaganda, because what it actually does is generally hurts powerful people and defeats propaganda if it works, which, sometimes it doesn't. Anyway, Fadi, who also writes in a lot on the forum, didn't get the joke. But he kind of developed the thoughts a bit further and said, I believe that we as humans are prone to groupthink, to just take things as they are and not to think too deeply. In other cases, it might not be feasible that you go down to all the details, so you use some kind of shortcut to come up with a conclusion. If everybody thinks it's okay, it's probably okay. Yeah, I've read there was in some kind of book, I think. I don't know when I read this, but I read this like theory that by evolution, this was kind of like about how the human brain works, and we have lots of these shortcuts, and you can kind of map it when you look at individual neurons and stuff like that. You can kind of see like the shortcuts we take, like our whole brain is set up to have like shortcuts, kind of like a processor works as well a little bit. Like we have this is why you have short-term and long-term memory and all this kind of stuff. And so one of the effects is that, for example, we tend to store. So if we get information, that we think is important, we tend to store the content, like the actual what it is about, in our long-term memory. But often unless we do, I think, have a specific process or have, make an effort. If we're just on autopilot, like if we just go through our lives, we store the information in long-term memory and the source in short-term memory, which is a problem in modern. I think actually the designer of Magic the Gathering was talking about this at some point in his podcast, and that's why I read the book he was talking about. Mark Rosewater has a podcast, Drive to Work. He talks about magic design, and I think he learned this like in media studies or whatever. And then this is like a problem in modern life, because we might get some information from like a book, right? We might like an expert book on the subject, or we might get it from an offhanded comment in like a soap opera, right? And because we store where we got that in short-term memory, and that might get deleted at relatively soon, then we just remember the information. So people remember lots of information, and they take like the thing they read in the car manual, like it's as canonical to them as something Jeremy Clarkson just said offhandedly in the Top Gear episode. So it's like it's a problem there. Like all these shortcuts, in the book there was more examples about like how we take shortcuts and why that was, because if you're in the steppe and like, so goes the theory, and like this animal's attacking you, then you don't really have time to think about all these, like really do like this was very interesting to me, especially in the pandemic also. It's a lot about like judging risk, right? We take a lot of shortcuts there, like your brain doesn't, like when the animal with the sharp fangs is, or what looks like an animal with sharp fangs, is sprinting towards you, you don't really have time to just do a whole risk assessment. Like your brain just goes to like fight or flight response and just does that based on a shortcut. And a lot of these things bite us in the ass when it comes to stuff like gambling and things like where people can't really judge how likely an outcome of something is. Has often a lot to do with that, because our brain's just not set up for this kind of thing, because we're not computers, we're not Vulcans, we're not Mr. Spock, we're human. Anyway, Fadi continues, but still I feel that we should be aware when we start to fall into just accepting things as they are without giving them a second thought. See, I think so as well. I think that's what that's what all the Greek philosophers always basically is, this is why we're an intelligent animal, right? So we can do that as sentient beings. And it's very important. Fadi says, so it might be needed sometimes to get reminded to think critically, and thanks Fab for the constant reminders. I give my best. Then Yevgeny replied. He was basically explaining that he made a joke, and then said, in the episode, they were replying to, in the episode, Fab mentioned that in his opinion, a journalist ultimately serves the good of society. Since this is a very important point, by the way. Since the good of society can be defined differently depending on who's defining, a journalist must necessarily act based on his or her views in this regard and promote the corresponding agenda, which is the only way to change this society and change. And you must change it to become better. Fab's agenda in this regard seems to be, among other things, critical thinking and the need to expand within and throughout the society, and the need to expand it within and throughout society. Funnily, using mass media to promote an agenda, however noble, is the very definition of propaganda that Fab's so critical of. So I agree with you. Yes, that is the definition of media. But I think, this was kind of tongue-in-cheek as well, but let me just address it because it's a good point. Yes, journalists often are instruments of propaganda. The moment somebody just takes PR, this happens in tech journalism all the time. Some guy writes about new Apple products. He basically just takes the the PR release, the press release from Apple, and just uncritically reflects that information in that moment, because PR is propaganda, you are an instrument of propaganda. And I think a journalist is behooved to not be that. It happens to all of us all the time, especially in today's world. It's very hard to fight that, but you should fight it tooth and nail. I think that is the one of the most important rules of being a journalist. Now, I disagree with a journalist must. I mean, I agree with. So so when I say for the good of society, what I think is like what I'm doing is for my reader or for my audience, right? So yes, I must base this on my view in this regard, but not only, right? I also must reflect the views of other people. That is important, right? This is why I keep saying on this podcast, if you disagree, please write in, because you kind of need to try and balance it. You can't just report it on your own view. Of course, it's all based on your biases and your views, true, but it's still not an agenda. I actually think the No Agenda podcast, by Adam Curry and John C. Dvorak, is such a good name, because obviously, there's nobody who doesn't have an agenda. But I would say my agenda for this podcast, as Fadi says, is to help people with critical thinking and to fight propaganda that has been, like this propaganda about vaccines that is just obviously not true. To fight that, and I think a journalist should do everything he or she can to not propagate an agenda. As a journalist, the agenda should be serving your readers, serving your audience. That should be your agenda. That's very hard, and sometimes you get co-opted by other people's agendas, right? So, for example, I have certain things I believe about war, and I'm a pacifist, and I believe we should always seek peace. And when I write about this, as I did in my newsletter, for example, if you go to fab.industries, you can sign up if you want. I was writing about the so-called 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war and why that is mistaken. And then I went into a thing about how, I think we should seek peace. When I write that, yes, I am in some way, maybe, because I am pro-peace, I am against sending weapons anywhere, including to Ukraine, right? I'm against Germany delivering weapons to Ukraine. In that moment, I am basically advancing the Kreml's, the Russian government's agenda. But I'm aware of that, right? And I'm not doing that per se. I'm not doing that because I think that is the right agenda. It's just like my viewpoint on this aligns with this agenda at that point. That doesn't mean I'm pro this war, pro the Russians or whatever. I still think we should fight them if we must. I just generally think that should be the last option, and I'm against war. So yeah, sometimes it kind of aligns, but I think as a journalist, you should always strive to have no agenda, so to speak, in the morning, everybody. We also had a comment in the forum on episode 42 by Johan, who's been with me for a long time listener, I think, since Linux Outlaws days. If I'm not mistaken, he sent me some very nice beer once, some Trappist beer. I think Westmalle, which was delicious. Anyway, Johan writes in, it's never written in before, been a listener of the Private Citizen for some time now, but I never got around to write in. That is until today. Which I appreciate a lot. Thank you for that. I really enjoy your shows, not because I always agree with what you say. Sometimes I agree, sometimes I couldn't disagree more. I wanted to let you know that I really liked your show about Dubai. I think you made a very interesting point over there. It is strange that freedom of religion, which is a form of freedom of speech, is often found more important than the freedom of, for example, spreading a conspiracy theory, which is also a form of that same freedom of speech. This is especially historically ironic because our current focus on freedom of speech is historically founded very much on both the French Revolution and, the American Civil War. So basically the French democracy and the democracy in the USA, who were both founded on the principle of freedom of speech, specifically because they were anti-religious. Because at the time, the king kind of usurped religion, as Louis XIV and the English kings were basically creating a state unified with a state religion, basically, and saying, I'm God, I'm always right. And in the burgeoning, I'm going to talk about that in an episode pretty soon, the Renaissance of scientific thinking rebelled against that. In the case of the French Revolution, very violently. And, the U.S. the War of Independence was also relatively violent. And so these countries were founded with freedom of speech specifically because they were anti-religion. But of course, the U.S. also a very religious country. So as you're right, it's also, freedom of religion is also freedom of speech. But the idea of having a constitution that guarantees freedom of speech was very much in response to religious power. Anyway, Johan continues. I have the impression that the idea to censor or prohibit, quote, unwanted speech often slips into our society by people that may have good intentions. They want to keep us all safe. But I think we should be very alert every time some instance wants to limit the things that we are allowed to say. Thank you for all the work you put into this podcast. And thanks for writing in, Johan. I appreciate this very much. It makes me very happy, especially when somebody who's never written in writes in. This is I've been listening for a long time. It just makes me happy. Yeah, and I do agree with that last sentiment wholeheartedly. I do also think that a lot of these people do this. They come from a good angle, they have good intentions, but the problem is, as we're talking about, inadvertently advancing an agenda. They kind of they're a bit naive. I think they don't realize the implications of what they're trying to do. Because in the end, it will not make us all more safe. In the end, it will end democracy. Because, that is essentially, if you study history, this is something they drum into you a lot. Essentially, this is the quintessential thing we learned in the French Revolution. This is what the French Revolution showed the world, that without... That's why, why it happened and why it had such a ripple effect. And we had, attempted revolutions in all of Europe, including Germany, at the time. If you do not have freedom of speech, you cannot have a democracy. That is basically it. A democracy only works because there's a free exchange of ideas. Right, a democracy, as we understand it today, is based on political parties and on brokering a consensus, however fraught and difficult, and shouting in parliament, whatever, within society. And this only works if we can voice different viewpoints and come to some kind of consensus, or in the end, it's a compromise. Basically, the democracy is always a compromise, and this only works if all of society, or the majority of the citizens in that state, believe in this process. And they can only believe in this process if they themselves are represented in it, which they can only be if they can voice their opinion, right? And it's not about talking on Twitter. In political science, or even in Germany, you learn this in school. It's your process for, if the state goes in a direction you don't like and you find dangerous or whatever, at some point, part of the process is creating a political party, right? So in Germany, the Green Party, which is currently has a lot of power, came about in the 80s, the late 80s, because people thought we need, people are caring about all these things, but nobody's caring about the environment. We need a party that represents the environment. And then they created the party, and then they have equity in the political process. Now, if you're not allowed to say that, if you're not allowed to express your opinion, you can't create that party. You can't find other people who have the same opinion, right? You're not allowed, right? If talking about climate change was outlawed and was censored, then you couldn't find other people that are interested in protecting our planet from it, and you couldn't, partake in democracy to change the course of society. And what these people don't understand, it's not about this whole system only works if you have if you don't base this decision on do I like, or do the majority of society think that this opinion is dangerous. It doesn't matter. Right? It's you're basically throwing out the baby with the bathwater in the process of trying to protect society from something and kind of outlawing the speech about that. You're cutting these people, if they're right or wrong doesn't matter, out of the democratic process. Right? They have no equity in the process anymore, which will cause them to get more and more ostracized, and at some point violent, and stuff like that will cause a revolution, and it has in society. You can see this. Okay, in history, generally, it hasn't happened so far in democratic countries, but this is how revolutions come across, when the government may be a king or the one-party system or whatever, excludes enough people from equity in the system, then at some point they become so disenfranchised that they will at some point start a revolution. And there's no reason that this can't happen to a democratic system, which is something that in political science is known. This is basic knowledge, and these people for some reason don't have that basic knowledge. That's very dangerous. But anyway, thanks for writing in, Johan. It was very nice that you wrote in, especially because you'd never written in before, and also because I kind of had heard from you before. So it's kind of cool to have somebody who's been on the journey through the different podcast projects that I've done over the past. That's kind of cool. And with that, let's start winding up this show, shall we? So the people that write in and give me feedback, not only the feedback I read out, but also the other feedback that they don't want to have read, or that's just hints or tips or links to something, or something I should check out, or whatever ideas of what episodes I should do. They're very, very helpful. That's why I call them producers. But then we also need other producers that kind of like in Hollywood. I need somebody to pay the bills, and not that they're really paying the bills, but they're helping out, so that's very important. So if you want to do that, you can become a patron of mine on Patreon, and I would like to at this point give credit to the people that do that, because they're very important to me. My showrunner, Sorgal Taran, executive producers Butterbeans, Jaroslav Lichtblau, Rizal, and Sandman616. Supervising producers 1I11G, Avis, Bennett Piata, Dave, IKN, Jackie Plage, Jonathan M. Heavy, Jonathan M. Hetai, sorry. Krunkel, he might be in chat, so I gotta be careful. Michael Mullen Jensen, Robert Forster, and Tobias Weber. Producers Andrew David. This is almost as bad as the Star Trek Discovery episode, more producers than actress. Andrew Davidson, Aslo C, Captain Eckert, David Potter, Dirk Didi, Fadi Mansour, Florian Pigosch, Joe Poser, Michael Small, Mika, Mr. Amish, Rick Bragg, RJ Tracy. Associate producers, Barry Williams, D. Jonathan, Johan Sonen, Kai Sears, Ricky M, Steve Hose, and Vlad. Thanks to all of you. I appreciate it. Many of these people have been around for years, supporting the podcast through thick and thin, through me releasing many episodes and not that many episodes. So thanks to all of you. I appreciate it a lot. And I also have to thank Bytemark at bytemark.co.uk, British cloud hosting company. They provide the servers for this stuff, which is becoming more and more important with the censorship and everything, in case this gets taken off YouTube and off Twitch or whatever. It's a podcast, so we have servers that they can't easily get to, so that is very important. So thanks to Bytemark for that. They're doing a good thing there. And then the rest of the credits, the theme song for the show is called Acoustic Roots by Ruru Kabzali. And I'm going to play us out with the song Our Own Thing by Binkley featuring Big Girl. This is a country song that I just found on Epidemic Sound, where I get the music for the show. And it kind of reminded me, it's called Our Own Thing, and it's about two people who are married. And it kind of reminded me of me and my wife, who tomorrow on the 1st will be our 21st anniversary of being together. And we kind of also have our own thing going, and I kind of thought that was, I don't know, it gave me a nice feeling when I heard that song, and so that's why I'm gonna play us out with that, and that's everything from me, I think, for this show. And I'll be back. I had this on my list for a while and got that other episode. Kind of wanted to get that out first because, Ukraine war. Oh, that reminds me. I mentioned the newsletter thing I wrote about that, but not the podcast episode you listened to last time. Oh my God. I'm really out of it today. I don't know what's going on here. I didn't sleep much last night. Maybe that seems to be it. I need a break now, so I'm gonna get out of here. Let's listen to this song and aim to misbehave and all of that. See you soon.
She thinks I'm a little lazy, I think she's a little crazy. We like summer and we like spring, watching wrestling in the ring. She ain't shy, she speaks her mind, tough as nails and smooth as wine. We burn hot as kerosene, baby, we got our own thing. She ain't skinny and I ain't tall, and that don't bother us at all. I run naked through the yard, she'd flash every police car, drinking wine and getting tired and shooting out the damn street lights. How does she put up with me? Oh, baby, we got our own thing. We got our own thing. We don't need no ring. We ain't rich, but son of a bitch, we're a hillbilly king and queen. Life don't seem so hard with you beneath the stars, 'cause we're growing 4-leaf clovers in the yard.
There ain't nothing that he can't fix. He's a hard-headed son of a bitch. We got married on the Georgian line. Watch out, ladies, this one is mine. He works hard and just don't quit, even if his pants don't fit. Lord, he'll be the death of me. Baby, we've got our own thing. We eat good like you ought to do. Mashed potatoes and gravy too. Picnic table out in the back. He's only had one heart attack. Pecan pie beneath the moon. Paper plates and plastic spoons. We're as close as two sardines. Baby, we got our own thing.
We got our own thing. We don't need no ring. We ain't rich, but son of a bitch, we're a hillbilly king and queen. Life don't seem so hard with you beneath the stars, 'cause we're growing 4-leaf clovers in the yard. as a cuckoo clock.
We're the weird ones on the block.
Stuffs some cash down in her bra.
I even like my mother-in-law.
She's my backwoods beauty queen.
Baby, we
Got
got
our own thing. We got our own thing. We don't need no ring. We ain't rich, but son of a bitch, we're a hillbilly king and queen. Life don't seem so hard with you beneath the stars, 'cause we're growing 4-leaf clovers in the yard. Yeah, we're growing 4-leaf clovers in the yard.
That kind of gave me a John Prine vibe. May you rest in peace. I like that song. Really cool. Yeah, that's it. That's it for the podcast recording. I am pretty much out of here now. I will be editing this podcast now and then probably going to bed because I'm tired as fuck. It wasn't a good night. happens sometimes. Yeah. So hope you're doing well. I'm just having. Give me a quick look here. I think Deadly Slop might be still playing Kerbal Space Program. Yeah, he is. Kerbal Space Program 2. He's in orbit. Man's in orbit. So let's rate Deadly Slop. If I can sort this out. Let's do that. Let us do that. Oh God, too many buttons. Too many buttons. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being part of the show. I actually have a hankering to also play some Kerbal 2, although it's gonna be it's buggy as hell, I think. But I don't know. I might tackle that at some point. I need to do some game streaming again. I've been too busy in doing other stuff for a long time. It's about time. Anyway, thanks for hanging around. If you want to stick around, I'm gonna rate you over to Deadly Slop. Otherwise, I'm gonna see you soon. Thanks for watching, everybody. Goodbye.